Pretty much every building you can see here is from the Soviet period, all the big blocks at least. I tell you Sam, these housing estates, they're not small. In fact, sometimes they can be huge. They were completely self-sufficient. They had their own schools, shops, entertainment centres, sports facilities and stadiums. A citizen wouldn't ever really need to leave his microregion. This housing project here actually doubles up as a bridge. Quite an interesting piece of architecture actually. Sometimes they did actually try to brighten up the big blocks a little bit by putting some patterns on them. I've just come next door to the adjacent housing estate. So the last one with a big highway going through was a little bit unusual. This one would appear to be more of a typical classic Soviet housing estate. The main street of the microregion quite often has a boulevard going through it. This one does, although it's a bit of an unusual one because it's just a tree-lined boulevard. Normally they're much wider than that and people can walk along them. These near-identical housing estates you find everywhere, they're a bit like the Lenin statues in a way, in so much as they provide a sense of familiarity, and familiarity breeds content.